Hi, I'm ED-SKaR, and I have a brand new M8 Greyhound or M20 Scout car from Italy that I'll build up for my American force to use in bolt action. I won this at my local tournament, so thank you to the Outriders MK for keeping wargaming accessible and for giving me the opportunity to replace my 3D printed Greyhound. Not to say that my old one is that bad at all, in fact it's fairly good, but it was my first green vehicle that I painted before I started using the modulation painting, which I'll mention later on. But back to this kit today. The kit also comes with the cotton wool smoke effects, American transfer sheet, and the bolt action stat cards, and that's all expected from any bolt action kit. The sprues are pretty good quality and are round profile sprues, so are handy for kit bashing pipes and that sort of thing on terrain. I also noticed that there's a lot of extra tabs of sprue poking out of the back of many of the parts. This is usually to ensure that any voids are pushed out of the model and into the extra sprue pieces, but I didn't find any of these with bubbles or voids, and so maybe it's more about balancing the sprue, I'm not sure. So let's get started. And as this is the first wheeled vehicle from Italy that I've built, this is also the first set of normal suspension underneath the vehicle that I've built, and that's because tracked vehicles tend to have the suspension on the side, kind of inside the track assembly. And I've always felt that the detail on the underneath of vehicles like this is a bit unnecessary, as it will never be visible because you tend not to view the model from underneath. But it's nice that it's there for anyone who wants to model it on its side, I guess. The suspension assemblies thankfully are just a few pieces, unlike a detailed display kit which would make you put every single bar, spring, axle and wire on individually. The pieces are all keyed nicely to fit into place into the hull's tub piece. After the two main pieces there are two smaller bars that go onto the sides, again keying pegs to ensure these go the right way round. Starting to build up the armour around the front with this armour panel. Not sure why this had to be separate from the tub, it's fairly plain, but it is. The wheels themselves are all in two pieces, making them hollow, and this is to prevent sinking marks. You do have to clean up the sprue gates properly, but they fit together very nicely once that's done, and all of those go onto the axles on the suspension set quite tightly. Some kits I have had recently have fairly loose fitting wheels to the point where they can be modelled turning, but all six here are quite tight, so you do have to press a little more firmly than I'd like to, given how thin and spindly all of the axle pieces are. Just ensure you clean up any mould lines and push in straight and they'll be fine. Similar to the front, there is a rear section of detail for the hull, including a fancy vent and a separate piece for the towing hitch. Now the instructions want me to put this really cool fire extinguisher in place next, and I'll show off those extra sprue tabs I mentioned earlier because they're a good example of them on this piece. The fire extinguisher goes in the main compartment behind the driver's seat, which if you model as an M20 or with the hatches open will look cool in the background, but I'll be modelling it buttoned up, and so I'll remove this piece and keep it for my bits box. There's also a radio in the fighting compartment, and that's a separate piece, and so if you want to paint that up really nicely you can do, but I just glued it down as it's not going to be that visible when the model is complete. And the fighting compartment tub fits into the lower hull tub, and you can see that these are the only areas that will be visible when the hatches are open, and so I guess the engine is in this space at the back. I was considering keeping the hull top separate for painting, but I decided in the end that it wasn't necessary for this kit, so I glued that down, and the vehicle is really starting to take shape now. Just these side skirts to go on, covering the top of the wheels, and the main hull is pretty much complete, although there are plenty of small parts and detail to go on now. For the gaps on the side there is some stowage, and there's a choice of either a couple of jerry cans or some ammo racks. I went with the ammo, although I'm not actually sure which type of ammo this is. Drums of something, perhaps 50 cal. The vehicle is supposed to have ears, or whatever these pegs sticking out the side are. I think they're supports for when the hatches are opened, but really these parts are so bedarn-neated small, I lost the first one, and the other pinged across the room, and I gave up and moved on without them. The hatches themselves can be modelled opened or closed. As I mentioned, I'm going with closed, but there is a driver's head and shoulders included with the kit. That's the only crew model. In front of that goes this little doodad, I believe a siren, and the headlights with protectors, thankfully as a single piece each, although the keying for these didn't want to fit into the hole, and so I shaved it down and glued them on just to the flat of the hull front. Now, you get to make a choice. The kit can build either the M8 tank destroyer or the M20 scout car, and the only difference between them is the M8 has a turret and the M20 has an open fighting compartment. For the M8, which I will be making, the fighting compartment is mostly covered by this plate that has the turret ring on it, although some of the internals will still be visible as the turret is open-topped. And as I'm building the M8, I'll glue the turret ring plate in place, but you could leave this separate and unglued to switch between the two variants if you wanted. Now, if you were to build the M20 variant, the fighting compartment's armour is actually very simple. This box piece has some stowage boxes on the inside to glue in place. I'm not sure I quite got them in correctly, but it's close enough. And then there's an MG ring that goes on top, which fits into the keying quite nicely. Once you get it the right way around. I put mine on the wrong way around first time. Finally, there's just this filler panel, and then that can be placed on the whole top if you're wanting to build the M20. There is also a bazooka and ammo, and you can place those anywhere around the vehicle or keep them in your bits box if you prefer. Back to my Greyhound, and the last details for the hull are the antenna. I always feel like replacing these with wire or something else that's a bit more flexible, as these little sticks of plastic can quite easily be damaged when transporting models. It also prevents the turret from moving fully, but I'll make it as intended just for this video, and maybe if I care enough I'll change it later, but probably not. And I only noticed this right at the end of the build, but there's also some tow hooks or lifting shackles. I managed to get the front ones in place, but one of the rear ones snapped, and the other one joined the hatch bumper on the other side of the universe when it pinged off into nowhere. But let's put all of that aside and deal with the M8's turret now. The gun's elevation is achieved by these small pegs in the front of the turret, which doesn't matter in the slightest because it's about to go horribly wrong. The armoured mantlet goes over the top of the barrel, but it fits extremely tightly, so tightly that I snapped the back of the barrel off when I was fitting the mantlet to it. From the outside, the gun barrel does look correct and elevates properly. Unfortunately, the interior is visible because the turret is open-topped. The breech of the gun is 3 pieces that fit together kind of like a 3D jigsaw puzzle and end up with a D-shaped hole for the key of the barrel that snapped away. So to fix this, I coated the entire thing in loads and loads of poly cement, and I stuck it to the rear of the barrel. I balanced it with some foam and I just left it overnight to set. And surprisingly, this worked. Although I made 100% sure by giving it way more poly cement in the morning, and also fitted the coax machine gun barrel in the front as well. There are 2 racks of 37mm ammo that are curved for the inside of the turret, and with those in place I fitted the front of the turret with the gun into place. As the turret is open, we also have a turret basket, although it's not enclosed underneath either. There are 2 little seats to be put in place, and then that just goes onto the bottom of the turret, although I'll take this off for painting later on. Similar to the M20, there is an MG ring for the M8's turret, and strangely this is actually a different design, and so you get one of each in the box, and so you don't have to share between them if you're making the kit modular. I still haven't worked out what these tiny little boxes are, but they didn't want to fit onto the MG ring, and so I ended up shaving away at bits of stuff and on both parts until they eventually went into place. And the final detail is the 50 cal anti-air gun for the top. This is just 2 pieces with the gun and ammo box separate. Now it has a ball mount, which is really cool, and I wanted to have it at a fun rakish angle, as if it was pointed by the crew to keep it out of the way, but this broke during painting and so it'll end up at a more boring angle. But with all the parts glued down, that's the model kit complete, because that's how model kits work, but there's also painting to do. I have painted quite a few American vehicles, to the point where it's probably really boring to have an entire another video doing the same paint scheme as I've done before, so I'll just squeeze it in to the end of this one. I primed in grey alongside a bunch of infantry for a dozen other projects, and then I coated the model in a dark brown with some mottled black and just a little subtle dry brushing of metallics. Now I've done this with the airbrush, but I've also done this with stipple brushing, and it works really well either way. The next step is a heavy coat of hairspray, because I'm using hairspray chipping that I've done before for my M10 Wolverine. And of course I now have to mention modulation, because it wouldn't be a painting video without me mentioning modulation. The whole armour of the vehicle gets a base coat of a darker green, and then every single armour panel, each feature, each hatch, every module gets a highlight in the middle with a lighter green, and this is to emphasise the edges being darker to give it some visual shape. With some decals in place, I went over the model with water and a middle stiffness brush. Now this didn't work when I did my M10, but I left that for several days and so it had all dried and properly cured. For this model, the hairspray was only an hour or so old, and so maybe that helped, or it might be that I was putting on the hairspray quite a bit more thickly than I did for the M10. Either way, I'm not sure. I'll probably have to do some more experimentation later. When I picked out the smaller details, like the tool handles in brown, I threw on some black paint for the wheels, and I dragged out my custom black wash, and that goes over the whole model. The black wash ties in the chipping and the modulation really nicely and also gives some pretty easy to do black lining. But my final step is always my favourite. Again, it's to bring out the shapes in the model and to prevent the wash from just seeming like a messy, lumpy horribleness over the whole model. By bringing the original light green from my modulation highlights, I'm going to edge highlight every detail on the model, but not too heavily. I keep having to remind myself to just be a little inconsistent, a little light here, a little heavier there, and not just outlining the whole model as if it was a cartoon. It always gets me excited to bring back the shape because of all of the natural variation from the various steps that come before it, and with that, my M8 armoured car from Italy is complete. And this is a big step up from my old one. The painting techniques that I've learned are the biggest difference, but going from a low quality print to a good quality model kit also helps. Let me know what you think in the comments, but for now, I'm ED-SKaR, always will be, and thank you very much for watching.